Well, good evening. My name's Giles French. I'm one of the church wardens here at St Mary Le Bow, and it's my privilege to welcome you all to our church this evening. And let me just quickly offer my thanks to all those who are involved in organising this evening's Boyle Lecture. It's a source of great pride to us that we host this annual lecture, and I look forward to hearing from both our lecturer and responder this evening. But I suspect you all know there's one exciting piece of news that we do want to share with you today. The reason why you're having to listen to me is because we are in the middle of a vacancy following last year's retirement of Father George Bush. And today I'm very pleased to be able to announce that we have appointed his successor, Reverend Dr. Simon Cuff, who is currently the vicar at St Peter's, Islington, will be our new rector, and I'm very pleased to say Simon will be joining us later in the year. We will announce his formal start date, if that's the correct theological term, later in the summer, and I know that he's very much looking forward to meeting all of you and joining us very soon. So I'm sure you will all offer your good wishes and prayers to Simon. Thank you very much. And now I will hand over to Professor Fraser-Watts. Thank you, Professor Fraser.
So thank you, Giles, for welcoming us here once again for the 22nd of this refounded series of Boyle Lectures. My name's Fraser-Watts. I'm here to represent the International Society for Science and Religion, which for several years now has shouldered the work involved in organising these Boyle Lectures under the wise guidance of a committee chaired by the 15th Earl of Cork and Orrery, a descendant of the Robert Boyle who founded these lectures, the first of which was given in 1692. And I'd also like to express the gratitude of all of us to the Mercers Company and the Grocers Company for their generous continuing support of these lectures. And it's a pleasure to welcome the Master Grocer and Master Mercer with us this evening. It's my pleasure and honour to introduce the 2025 Boyle Lecturer, the Most Reverend Dr. Angie Jacqueline, Archbishop Emerita of Uppsala and Primate Emerita of Sweden. We're immensely grateful to her for travelling to the UK to give the Boyle Lecture today. There's no church leader anywhere of comparable seniority who's contributed so much over many years to the coordination of Christian theology with contemporary science, and who's given it such priority. Thank you, Angie, for all that you have done, and please take this invitation to give the Boyle Lecture this evening as an expression of our appreciation. Dr. Jacqueline has received so many honours and distinctions that if I were to mention them all, there'd be no time left for her lecture. But in addition to the very senior position she's held in the church, let me also mention her important PhD thesis on time and eternity, her time as an associate professor of the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, her 6 years as president of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology. She holds several honorary doctorates and has a list of at least 12 books published over the last 25 years, mostly in Swedish, but her most recent book in English is God is Greater, Theology for the World. In recent years, she's been increasingly focused on how the massive shift of technology through digitalization has developed synergies with other processes in societies, which in turn pose challenges to spiritual sustainability. And that's what she'll focus on this evening. Immediately after the Boyle Lecture itself, we'll hear a response from Professor Arthur Peterson. And so the proceedings can run without further interruption from me. I'll introduce him now as well. Professor Peterson is Professor of Science, Technology and Public Policy at University College London. Very unusually, he holds 3 doctorates, one in atmospheric sciences, another in philosophy of science and technology, and most recently in theology and science. He also holds far too many distinctions for me to cover, but let me mention two important books: Simulating Nature, about how computer simulation uncertainties affect policy advice on climate science, and more recently, Climate, God, and Uncertainty. He's also the current editor of the journal Zygon, in which the Boyle Lectures have been published for some years now. But enough from me. It's my great pleasure to invite the Most Reverend Dr. Angie Jacqueline to give the 2025 Boyle Lecture on science, technology, theology, and spirituality, a necessary partnership. Angie.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction and for the invitation to speak to you tonight. I feel honored and very happy to be here. I also wish to express my gratitude to the committee responsible for the Boyle Lectures and its chair, the Earl of Cork and Orrery, as well as to all who have worked to make this happen, especially the church wardens of St. Mary Le Bow. And as you may have noted, the theme of my lecture ends with a question mark. And you may assume that my answer to the question is yes. Science, technology, theology, and spirituality, a necessary partnership? Yes. That's of course correct. As often is the case, the most intriguing part is not the answer itself, but the path towards it. And hence, I would like to share some reflections on that path with you. For a long time, this affirmative answer was anything but obvious. 66 years ago, C.P. Snow famously talked about the two cultures. And his point was that the lack of communication between the sciences and the humanities would hamper constructive engagement with the world's problems. However, while Snow saw the neglect of science by many of the highly educated of his days as the main problem, a disrespect of science by the humanities, as it were, I have often encountered the opposite, a disrespect of the humanities by scientists. In a conversation about the significance of hermeneutics in the framing and communication of research, a scientist responded, "Hermeneutics? Never heard of it. Can't be important." And in the country where I live, and I have lived for most of the past 48 years, Sweden, it is quite common to favor science and technology over the humanities. That is where the money is, and that is where the money goes. Tech is serious, while the humanities are a hobby. Such views are alive even at government level. Some years ago, a tweet was circulated that caricatured a consequence of this attitude. It said, "In the financial world of Paris, lots are drawn to see who will meet a Swedish businessman. No one wants to, because they can only talk money, possibly golf. No one has read novels. No one has seen art. No one has any religion." Now, this is certainly not the whole truth about Swedish businessmen. What is true, however, is that polarization between the world of science and technology on the one hand and the world of the humanities and theology on the other leads straight into cultural poverty. This, in turn, dramatically shrinks our chances of adequately meeting the challenges humanity is facing. Challenges that today can be summarized with the words climate and conflict, digitalization and democracy. We need strong, vibrant, critical and self-critical partnerships between science, technology, theology, and spirituality. To substantiate this claim, I will now briefly reflect on what brought us to the point where we are. The history of the relationship between science and theology in the Western world is not unlike the dynamics of a growing family. During the Middle Ages, theology was the queen of the sciences. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas created a powerful synthesis of the best knowledge about theology, philosophy, and nature, drawing on the philosophy of Aristotle, which had come to Christian Western Europe thanks to the high standards of Muslim scholarship. Christian theology inspired scientific inquiry, where God is understood as the creator who has endowed the cosmos with order and humans with creative rationality. Inquiry into how the cosmos works can indeed be a way of worship. Reading and understanding both the book of Scripture and the book of nature becomes a noble enterprise. In that sense, early modern science was a child of theology. Many of the pioneers of modern science were close to theology or the church. Nevertheless, just as children struggle their way through adolescence, the natural sciences had to strive for their emancipation and autonomy. At least since the days of René Descartes, much of Western Christian theology has had the separation of nature and thought, res extensa and res cogitans, as its paradigm. The pre-modern view of the world, which saw the relationship between the book of nature and the Bible as symmetrical and complementary, was replaced by a modern view that tended to separate spirit and idea from matter and body. This resulted in a mechanistic view of nature, which permitted the exploitation, the over-exploitation of nature, often legitimized by theological discourses of humans, men, as the crown of creation. Humans became alienated from nature, from the whole of creation. Such separation of nature and humanity provided fertile ground for patriarchal and sexist views of nature and science. The program of the Royal Society, founded in 1660, reflects a view of nature as the woman that the male scientist must conquer. Research is envisioned as the systematic unveiling of Mother Nature, exposing her secrets, penetrating her womb, and thus forcing her into submission. Or more poetically, quote, "The beautiful bosom of nature will be exposed to our view. We shall enter into its garden and taste its fruits and satisfy ourselves with its plenty." End of quote. Oppression and exploitation in romantic disguise, as that is, and in similar ways, colonial worldviews have exercised power in both science and theology. God moved into the emotional dimensions of life, while the natural world became the arena of technology, and industrialization. As German physicist and philosopher Karl Friedrich von Weizsäcker put it drastically, die Theologie hat der Naturwissenschaft die Natur zum Fraße hingeworfen. In non-literal translation, theology has thrown nature under the bus of natural science. Be that as it may, we ended up in a world that fell apart. On the one hand, desecrated nature as an object for science and technology. Think of Max Weber, Die Entzauberung der Welt. On the other hand, religiosity, spirituality as something subjective and private. As a methodological separation for the sake of research, this may have been a necessary and productive separation at the dawn of modern science. However, seen as an ontological or existential necessity, this separation was and is disastrous. Dualisms, such as one is objective, the other is subjective, one is rational, the other one is irrational, are untenable. As is the apologetical misuse of science along the lines, and the Bible is right after all. It is worth noting that although the field often is referred to as science and religion, the dialogue partner of science, however understood, is not religion as such, but rather theology, which I define as the critical and self-critical reflection about the content and the effects of a religious tradition, in my case, mostly Christian tradition. And I agree with a previous Boyle lecturer, Robert J. Russell, who wrote, quote, "To some limited but irreducible degree, theology and science already include something of the discoveries, histories, visions, and commitments of one another, both intentionally and inadvertently," end of quote. Against this backdrop, I have argued for an intellectually honest theology that includes an understanding of the world as open-ended, creative at its boundaries and rough edges, and ambiguous in its potentialities. And this ambiguity implies that a partnership between theology and science always must remain unfinished business. Together with the common responsibility of both for the world, this ambiguity stirs up some healthy unrest in what could become a cozy togetherness between two partners who have come to know their standard rejoinders all too well. I've been part of this dialogue for about 4 decades, both as an academic and as a church leader. And it may very well be the case that church leadership has motivated me to look more at the impact of science turned into technology on life on the planet, and on theology as a catalyst of spirituality inspiring action. And when I look back at those 40 years, I notice some interesting developments. Now, very roughly speaking, back in the 1980s, the dialogue was pretty much about physicists trying to bring theologians up to speed on quantum theory, and for their own part, trying to understand the philosophical consequences of the uncertainty principle. Then, molecular biologists showed up and said something like, look, we don't really need religion. It's all in the genes, you know. And in the end, there will be a biological explanation of everything. After them, cognitive scientists entered the stage. And their take was different. They said, well, religion is natural, sort of. And we witnessed a renaissance of the homo religiosus, the idea that humans have an inherent inclination towards religion, a religious musicality, as it were. And recently, climate scientists have come on board, and their message is, we need religion because we need positive social tipping points to get away from an otherwise catastrophic development. And achieving those tipping points includes religion. We won't reverse the curves and save the planet without it. And nowadays, we hear even politicians say that the climate crisis also is an existential and spiritual crisis. So if I am to summarize my position on theology and science in just one sentence, I choose the image of a triangle drama. It is a dynamic love triangle between faith in knowledge, science, the knowledge of faith, theology and spiritual wisdom, and their common responsibility for the world. It is after all in this common responsibility for the world that the rubber hits the road. For precisely this reason, it is important to acknowledge that partnerships between science, technology, theology, and spirituality always take place in specific contexts. And therefore, I will now move on to a brief sketch of current contexts. I don't know whether you will agree, but here we go. Polycrisis is a word frequently used to describe the state of the world, meaning the occurrence of several crises at the same time: climate emergency and loss of biodiversity, war, which besides everything else also is an ecological disaster, conflict and crime, global migration, economic crises, the global decline in democracy, and the ambivalence of digitalization and AI. Polycrisis happens in a world that is widely marked by what I have called the 5 poisonous P's of polarization, populism, protectionism, post-truth, and patriarchy. Now, polarization widens the gap between those who have too much and those who have too little, creating climate, education, health, demographic, and intergenerational injustice. Populism pits people against each other and fails to do justice to the complexities of the current crises, thus nurturing hostility and even hate toward those who are different from us, and claiming primacy or superiority of one group over the others, which in turn results in racism, xenophobia, and irrational fear of ethnic, religious, or sexual minorities. Protectionism, the 3rd P, blurs the view of the global scope of polycrisis, sacrificing the common good for self-interest and promoting egoism and nationalism. Post-truth, with the dissemination of disinformation and lies, undermines honest communication that is absolutely vital to every democratic system. Patriarchy boosts a global pushback on the rights of women and girls, promoting toxic masculinities, and counteracting gender justice. It develops a destructive synergy together with the other four poisonous Ps. In such a scenario, it is no surprise that we see a rise in mental health issues and scarcity when it comes to a hope that enables people to act well in uncharted territory. In response, joint forces that work truly transdisciplinary are called for. We have been used to seeing rational accounts of the best knowledge available as the main task of the dialogue between science and theology. As important as those rational accounts are, they are not enough, because to be fully intellectual includes spiritual perspectives. In the current cluster of crises, this becomes ever more evident. To cope, hope, and act, humans need access also to spiritual perspectives. And I'm convinced that communicating spiritual insights requires as much acumen as the dissemination of rational knowledge. A spiritual vacuum prevents people from mobilizing their full potential. It leads to an increase in fear instead of fostering the courage that is needed for change and adaptation. It may even be the case, that the propensity to embrace conspiracy theories increases due to the lack of a culture that is both rationally and spiritually sound. That is, a culture that I would call fully intelligent. In other words, we are at a point where we need to have a fresh look at possible partnerships between science and theology from the perspective of spirituality. I will now move on and try to explore what such partnership might mean today. And to that end, I turn to a topic that engages and affects people in almost all walks of life, namely artificial intelligence, AI. In a paper from 1917, the founder of the psychoanalytic school, Sigmund Freud, describes 3 narcissistic injuries, violations, or insults. I'm not sure what the best English translation of the German word Kränkungen would be, narzisstische Kränkungen. Anyway, let's go for insult for tonight. We can discuss that later, maybe. Freud said the first narcissistic insult came with the heliocentric worldview and the insight that we are not the center of the universe. It was followed by 2 more. The loss of the position as the crown of creation through the theory of evolution, and the loss of sovereignty over oneself through the discovery of the power of the unconscious. So Copernicus stood for the first insult, Darwin for the second, and of course Freud, according to himself, for the third and most serious one. Now, had Freud heard of generative AI or artificial general intelligence, he would have been prompted to add a 4th narcissistic insult of the human person. The cosmological, biological, and psychological insults are followed by the intellectual insult. How we will cope with this one remains to be seen. There are several ways, of course, of managing the threat by AI of our intelligence. Even though the achievement and range of AI can be breathtaking in many ways, we can still question the term artificial intelligence altogether. One may speak of co-intelligence instead, indicating, for example, that the resources that large language models provide are to be used complementary to our own mental resources and nothing else. One can also argue that so far AI is rather stupid compared to the many facets of human intelligence. There's much to support this claim. As some have put it, a large language model is a stochastic parrot because it is a system for haphazardly stitching together sequences of linguistic forms it has observed in its vast training data according to probabilistic information about how they combine, but without any reference to meaning, a stochastic parrot. That was a quote from an academic paper. Well, AI is far from exceeding human intelligence when compared to the whole range of different capacities that together constitute human intelligence. With Fraser Watts, we can speak of a variety of intelligences, such as artistic, personal, and moral, that are all connected to a mode of intelligence that is embodied, intuitive, socially embedded, and effective, and holds special importance for spirituality. The opposite of such a stochastic parrot, as it were. That's all correct. And yet, it's not the point, or at least not the whole point. One can argue that AI is not built to imitate the ways human intelligence develops and works. With its identity in computation and statistics, AI is profoundly different from human intelligence. This does not mean, however, that it cannot deal a fateful blow to human intelligence with dramatic effects on our human self-understanding, because the speed, volume, and complexity of data processing that constitutes AI can reach levels that render those distinctions irrelevant. When human intelligence no longer has the means to judge the plausibility of what AI tells us, on issues that are of, say, societal insignificance, a line is crossed. Or when it no longer matters that an AI is not sentient in human ways, but merely pretends, another line is crossed. In the end, it is the result rather than the method that matters. Put a bit differently, as crucial as issues such as syntactic correctness and incomplete or biased training material for AI systems are, the real challenge is to reflect on the different futures that the ongoing massive shift of technology is ushering in. While we may keep wavering between a techno-messianism and techno-dystopia, economic incentives tend to accelerate development and leave critical humanistic reflection behind. If financial interests are the only ones in the driver's seat, new technology will most likely fail to contribute to a good society for all. Seen that way, the development and proliferation of AI sends us back to the basics of anthropology and sociology, considering the intellectual violation or insult through AI, what then is a human being, individually and socially? What does the imago Dei, created in the image of God, mean in relation to AI and robots? As humans, we live in relationships with the transcendent, with nature, with each other, and ourselves. That is a fourfold web of relationality: the transcendent, nature, each other, self. How will this fourfold web of relationality work out in the context of AI? Addressing questions like these forces us to revert to basic existential questions, such as how we understand reason. And to that end, I find it helpful to revisit the distinction between ratio and intellectus by the 15th century polymath Nicholas of Cusa. Came from Bernkastel-Kues in the Mosel. Some of you may have been there and had some Mosel Riesling. That's where Nicholas Cusa comes from. Both Latin words, ratio and intellectus, mean understanding or reason, but in different ways. Ratio is the reason that counts. Literally, ratio means counting, calculation. And calculating and controlling reason is needed for everything, from making everyday life work to conducting experiments that can push the boundaries of knowledge. Ratio will take us a long way. But ratio alone does not provide intelligence. Full-fledged reason also needs intellectus. The Latin verb intellegere means to perceive, realize, understand. Intellectus is the reason that stands for insight, understanding, and meaning. Intellectus is not, however, the opposite of ratio. Using intellectus is not the same as being irrational. Rather, without intellectus, ratio is not fully rational. Ratio calculates, controls, monitors. Intellectus has its strength in looking and listening, both inwardly and outwardly, toward the horizon of the unknown. Intellectus can relate to the immeasurable and to what we humans can never fully know. We could say that intellectus knows the unknowable precisely as unknowable. Ratio must surrender to the unknowable. Intellectus can relate to the unknowable without wanting to turn it into knowledge. Intellectus understands that there are things that cannot or should not be forced into human calculations, that there are things that cannot or should not be at our disposal, as argued by German sociologist Hartmut Rosa in his book Unverfügbarkeit, The Uncontrollability of the World in English. There are existential truths that we cannot conquer on our own. They are more likely to come to us when we hone our skills of enduring the unknowable, or, in other words, when we care about the spiritual dimensions of existence in the world. Modernity has had a penchant for ratio. It has flattered our need for control and given us the partly illusory, yet very real sense that we can plan and control most things in our lives, even in the life of the planet. The guarantee of progress was seen in regularly updated policies and procedures, rather than in the schooling of judgment by refining our intellectual qualities. Now that modernity must mature, it is useful to refocus on the necessary togetherness of ratio and intellectus. It is high time to forge a partnership that includes science, technology, theology, and spirituality. The idea that human intelligence is characterized by the interplay between ratio and intellectus is relevant for how we can deal with the intellectual insult by AI. No doubt, when it comes to ratio, the achievements of AI are increasingly impressive and overwhelming. It is the intellectus aspect that makes the artificial intelligence adventure so much trickier. It is the intellectus aspect that allows us to call today's AI quite stupid after all. AI can be characterized as here-based and profane, whereas human intelligence can make sense of the there and experience transcendence. When a large language model perceives patterns or objects that are non-existent and creates nonsensical or inaccurate outputs, this is called a hallucination. Hence, one is tempted to quip, artificial intelligence hallucinates, human intelligence transcends. Such differences are not trivial because what happens in the disembodied and placeless depths of an unfolding algorithm touches the embodied lives of children, men and women in all kinds of spaces and places. Or in more theoretical words, in accepting large amounts of web text as representative of all of humanity, we risk perpetuating dominant viewpoints, increasing power imbalances, and further reifying inequality. And of course, the theologian inside me gets to her toes here, saying, this is a call for justice to heed. What then are the resources we can use to live up to this call within a theology and science context? And I want to suggest that we turn our attention for a moment to a project that brings together science, theology, and spirituality to heal the wounds of injustice inflicted by colonialism. In his forthcoming book, A Liberation Theology of the Brain, Neuroscience, Theology, and Decolonizing Emotions, Carmelo Santos Rolón brings a decolonial perspective to bear on the dialogue between neuroscience and theology. His work can serve as an example of a partnership between science, theology, and spirituality in action. Drawing on both neuroscience and theology, Santos Rolón pursues a rationally grounded, fully intellectual, and therefore also spiritual goal, namely, quote, the project of healing the colonial wounds that we all carry collectively and individually on our minds and brains and bodies, end of quote. He argues that our affective cognitive systems function like a sort of generative grammar that gives moral and ontological weight and texture to our perceptual reality. These grammars are shaped by the historical and cultural milieus we grow up in and with. Reshaping these, such as decolonizing our emotions, requires transformation of what he calls our holistic embodied selves. And based on neuroscience, Santos Rolón contends that religious symbols, rituals, narratives, and practices can have the power to achieve that. Much like theologian Vitor Westheller, Santos Rolón emphasizes the importance of space in theology, often neglected in traditional Western theology. Theology needs to pay more attention to the categories of place, such as the margins, eschata, and space between spaces, chora, if it wants to speak about justification and justice to those dwelling on the margins and in the space between spaces. This includes those suffering the bitter consequences of colonization, those pushed between places and no places in times of global migration, as well as those disenfranchised, left out and left behind in the world of algorithms. Santos Rolón argues that the language that emerges from the experiences that take place in the margins, the eschata, and the spatial cracks, the chora, spaces that are social, spiritual, psychological, and physical, has the potential to destabilize structures of oppression that are an expression of sin. He asks, quote, "What if the task of theology is more than just constructing a rational and coherent articulation of the faith, but also a poiesis, a midwifery of the soul, or better yet, of embodied selves and worlds made of flesh and word?" End of quote. In other words, what he tries to do is to flesh out what a partnership between science, theology, and spirituality can be and do. Let me add, very briefly indeed, yet another area where the partnership between science, technology, theology, and spirituality can make a difference, namely the science of sustainability. It is not so well known that the term sustainability has roots in the world of the church. More precisely, in the World Council of Churches in the 1970s. From there, it made its way into the famous Brundtland report from 1987. And since then, sustainability has largely been defined in terms of ecology, economy, and sociology. There is some current research, however, that signals awareness of the link between spirituality and sustainability, and the benefits of including spirituality in research and teaching on sustainability. It can be argued that better integration of spirituality and sustainability leads to more effective strategies for future development. Given this, and the fact that more than 80% of the world's population has a religious affiliation, there is a strong case for expanding traditional understandings of the concept of sustainability to comprise not only the three common dimensions of ecological, economic, and social sustainability, but also a fourth one, spiritual sustainability. Now I need to come to a close here, and I will conclude this lecture by just becoming a little more practical, saying what would it mean to foster a spirituality of hope? I've argued elsewhere that we in our time need a spirituality of coexistence, resilience, and hope. Now, tonight, I will restrict myself to sharing some thoughts about a spirituality of hope. Cultivating a spirituality of hope will enable us to counter narratives of hate and fear with narratives of love and courage, urgently needed in times of polycrisis. And hope is both a gift and a virtue. It works like a muscle. A muscle is a gift in our body, but you need to train and exercise to maintain and develop its strength. The same applies to hope. Train it, practice it. Hope differs from optimism. Optimism, as well as pessimism, builds on what we already know. Optimism extrapolates those facts which we regard as positive at the present time. Optimism loves graphs, especially when they point in the right direction. Both optimism and pessimism build on statistics, which can lead into deception. After all, we have all heard of lies, damned lies, and statistics. But hope can be deceitful as well. Like human endeavors, all human endeavors, even such a good thing as hope can take the wrong turn, be distorted and abused. And yet, there is an important difference between optimism and hope. While optimism extrapolates the trend, hope is the practice of spotting the promise. Optimism aims at extending reality, while hope wants to change it. Optimism draws conclusions based on the known. Hope looks forward in anticipation, finding ways of dealing constructively with that which we do not and cannot know. Hope draws on the best knowledge available, whether it comes from science or theology or the dialogue between various disciplines. It combines ratio and intellectus in a deeply sustainable way. Hope is characterized by a threefold potential. First, hope does not close its eyes to that which can elicit despair. Rather, hope holds the power to harbor anger, grief, and frustration over that which is and goes wrong, in how humans take care of each other and this world and this planet. Second, hope relates wisely to both our strength, our power, our ingenuity and creativity, and to our vulnerability, weakness, destructivity, and mortality. Hope is realistic and humble. And third, most of the time, we are still left with choices. Hope empowers us to make a choice that remains a possibility in most situations, to choose the path of courage rather than a different one. Powerful, humble, and courageous, that's what hope is. While optimism rejoices at the continuity of a graph moving in the right direction, hope sees meaning despite and through the leaps and cracks of discontinuity. After all, as Leonard Cohen has taught us about the crack, that's how the light gets in. Is this just words? Yes, but words matter. Words shape thoughts. Thought shape ideas. Ideas shape policies. Policies shape actions. Actions shape societies. In the beginning was the word, as a famous phrase in a wise and influential book puts it. This rings true even as we strive for the necessary partnership of science, technology, theology, and spirituality. Therefore, staying in conversation with and about that which is of ultimate concern will keep our humanity and inspire necessary action. And therefore, such institutions as the Boyle Lecture are worth our care and efforts. Thank you very much for listening.
I applaud the Most Reverend Dr. Antje Jacquelin for defending so clearly the importance of the humanities in the deployment of science and engineering for social change. Scientists and engineers have to grapple with wicked problems such as the governance of AI and sustainable development, which have repercussions at all scales, from the global to the local. In doing this, natural scientists and engineers need to engage with both social scientists and humanities scholars. And not only that, through this engagement, they also need to open up to the spiritual, not as a separate, well-defined category, but as an integral element of quality of life, part of Martha Nussbaum's list of central human capabilities, in particular the capability of having sense, imagination, and thought. Our senses, imagination, and thought can give rise to spiritual experience. And while this, of course, leads to important philosophical and theological questions about the causes and consequences of such spiritual experience, the particular question that the Boyle Lecture puts in front of us is, how can science and technology engage with the spiritual? In my response, I will unpack this question in three parts. First, the obstacles for theology and the possibilities for philosophy to help scientists and engineers in engaging with the humanities and with spirituality. Second, the centrality of experience and uncertainty in all domains of culture, which I define in a very wide sense as the field of resources that practitioners in a practice draw on, be it a scientific or an engineering practice, a religious practice, a political practice, and so on. And third, the implications of all this for addressing the spiritual in policy making for sustainable development. So first, on theology and philosophy. Jacquelin singles out theology for the engagement of the humanities with science and technology. This makes perfect sense in contexts where theology has an accepted role to play. Jacquelin acknowledges that these contexts are diverse, and I will not argue against the importance of theological reflective thought playing this role. But what are the proper roles of which theologies where in our global culture, or patchwork of cultures? At least in the present cultural climate in the West, I do see many obstacles for creating the strong partnerships between science, technology, theology, and spirituality that Jacquelin is proposing. For instance, when in secular societies, godless institutions such as University College London desire to relate to the spiritual, they cannot draw on theology like a church can do. But they can, alternatively, draw on philosophy. The indigenous and pre-modern cultures that preceded modernity and in the contemporary world are enmeshed in the web of modernity may have seen a dominant role for spirituality and theology. But we cannot go back to the spirituality of indigenous thought or to the theology of pre-modernism. Spirituality, like religion, seems to have become more of a private than a public matter. Moreover, spirituality is increasingly found outside of religious traditions. Crucially, one must realize that there is no single dialogue between science and technology on the one hand, and religion, theology, and spirituality on the other hand. This all leads to the present situation that in our culture, after first having gone through modernity and subsequently through postmodernity, the voices of critical and self-critical theologies seem not to be able to create spiritual publics that can mobilize politics or spiritual attitudes that can deeply affect science and technology. While there's no single dialogue and no single potential partnership, according to recent philosophical work, there is a plurality of options for making connections between different domains in culture. I would like to suggest that the rehabilitation of spirituality religion, and theology, which are separate things, in a form that can fruitfully engage with science and engineering, is afoot in a new form that goes by the name of metamodernism. Metamodernism, which is what comes after and transcends postmodernism, which came after and transcended modernism. It offers an integrated worldview, a cultural logic of cultural logics, in which things can be both social constructs and real at the same time, and in which one is able to toggle between pre-modern, modern, and postmodern worldviews without losing oneself fully in any one of these. I do not have the space to dwell on this recently emerging current in philosophy here. I will just signal that philosophy can be of help in brokering a spiritual way forward in science and engineering for social change. Science and engineering for social change also happens to be the name of an undergraduate degree that we have recently launched at UCL. And this degree involves a mandatory module in philosophy of culture that explicitly addresses religion and the spiritual in its larger cultural settings worldwide. Second, on experience and uncertainty, Jacqueline highlights the importance of intellectus versus ratio. Metamodern philosophy foregrounds experience and uncertainty while not forgetting about values. This means that in all domains of culture, science, technology, religion, politics, etc., once you scrutinize what is going on in their practices, the philosophical attention can get drawn to the experience of wonder and judgment under uncertainty. For instance, if one looks with Bruno Latour at science in the making, a strikingly different picture emerges from that of ready-made science. Once scientists and engineers pause to reflect on their practices, and they do that all the time to assess the risks and uncertainties, they are aware that they are creating change of reference or constants through transformations in the case of science, and inventions that rearrange technology in ingenious ways to circumvent obstacles in the case of engineering. But they are also aware that they are always at risk to be wrong. So the question is, how ratio, calculating, controlling, monitoring, is used in the different practices, especially science and engineering, versus intellectus, judgment, understanding, reflective openness to uncertainty. I would argue that science and engineering cannot be done without either. But I also agree with Jacqueline that modernity has had its preference for ratio and forgotten intellectus, even though intellectus has always been there. Then what do you think happens, for instance, to authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who allow themselves only a modernist repertoire of talking and thinking about science, when a country delegation emphatically asks them to include Mother Earth in the summary for policymakers of the report on adapting to climate change? I witnessed this in Yokohama in 2014. And the authors were like deer staring in headlights. The compromise text that they in the end came up with did not include Mother Earth and effectively only referred to a potential for instrumental use of indigenous knowledge. I quote, "Indigenous, local, and traditional knowledge systems and practices, including indigenous peoples' holistic view of community and environment, are a major resource for adapting to climate change, but these have not been used consistently in existing adaptation efforts." End of quote. I'm not sure how to do this better, since there is a fundamental incommensurability between Western science and non-modern worldviews. But we surely should train our scientists and engineers to be able to deal with the spiritual in a less instrumental way. At the same time, we shouldn't other indigeneity too much, given the complex ways in which indigenous thought is enmeshed in modernity nowadays. We need to refrain from making a binary distinction between modern and non-modern, and give attention to localized differences in how cultural values are realized, and to the political agency of marginalized indigenous communities facing ecological crisis. Thirdly, sustainable development and the spiritual. Jacqueline mentions the science of sustainability as a major area where engagement with the spiritual can make a difference. And to conclude my response, I would like to briefly expand on the link between sustainable development and the spiritual. As Jacqueline points out, the history of the concept of sustainability lies in the Church. From the way that the World Council of Churches described a sustainable society in 1974, one can argue that the spiritual is an aspect of quality of life that needs nurturing. I quote, "The benefits of more material production and the material demands of an increasing number of people no longer outweigh the negative effects of this growth on the non-material dimensions of the quality of life." End of quote. Jacqueline's plea to expand some overly simplistic understandings of sustainability consisting of three narrowly defined dimensions of ecological, economic, and social sustainability, and then to include the dimension of spiritual sustainability deserves support. The related policy question becomes, however, how governments can assess this spiritual sustainability, let alone propose and implement policy measures to protect and grow it. On this topic, the Church of Sweden and the Swedish municipality of Ljusdal have shown leadership that merits closer study and reflection to learn how the rest of the world might benefit from these approaches. In terms of sustainability assessment for policy making, I think that scenario-based approaches that rely on a comprehensive notion of quality of life have potential to bring out more explicitly the dimension of spirituality. Thus, I would like to thank the Archbishop for raising these important issues, and this concludes my response. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like to offer our gratitude to lecturer and responder for an evening of stimulating ideas, difficult ideas, but timely ideas. And it's a joy that we've been able to do this now for 22 years, offering this kind of forum for this kind of exchange. In the continuation of that tradition, just to let you know that we'll be having this lecture next year on the 16th of March. The speaker next year, the lecturer, will be Ian McGilchrist, who's a British psychiatrist, literary scholar, philosopher, neuroscientist, a fellow of so many bodies I can't list them here, and emeritus consultant at the Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital. He's the author of a book called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, of which one reviewer said, "A giant in this vital field shows convincingly that the degeneracy of the West springs from our failure to manage the binary division of our brain." So something to look forward to this time next year. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.